The lounge at Chicago's International Airport was built for comfort. Soft leather chairs, quiet music, the kind of place where deals worth millions were whispered over glasses of wine. But that night, comfort shattered in a single sentence. "Do you even know how to hold a tray? People like you don't belong in places like this." The words landed harder than the coffee that had splashed onto Richard Hale's sleeve. The air snapped silent. Conversations cut mid-sentence. A fork froze inches from a plate. Heads turned, eyes narrowing, phones tilting upward to catch what had just happened. Richard didn't flinch. He tugged at his cuff, annoyed at the stain, as if the true mess was not his words but the drop of liquid. He leaned back in his seat like a man untouchable, the kind of man who believed money excused cruelty. But the target of his remark stood steady. Maya Johnson gripped the tray in her hands, her knuckles pale against the polished metal, yet her body refused to shrink. She didn't snap back. She didn't whisper an apology she didn't owe. She simply met the silence with silence, her eyes calm, her breath measured. And that was what shook the room most, not the insult, but the way she carried it. A businessman near the bar whispered, "Did he really just say that?" A woman lowered her glass, her lips tight. In the corner, a phone screen glowed brighter, recording every detail, the arrogance in Richard's smirk, the grace in Maya's stillness. Richard, used to having the last word, smirked as if the matter was closed. But something in the air had shifted. The room wasn't on his side anymore. Maya adjusted the tray, placed it carefully on a side table and stood tall. She didn't look at Richard. She looked beyond him, as though to remind everyone watching that his words would not define her. And in that moment, though Richard Hale thought he had won the exchange, every person in that lounge understood a truth he did not. The man in the suit wasn't the most powerful figure in the room. The woman he tried to belittle was. What the lounge couldn't see, what no phone camera could capture in that moment, was the life behind Maya's silence. She wasn't just another server in a pressed uniform. She was a 27-year-old woman who had already lived through storms that would have broken most people twice her age. Her story began in a small apartment on the South Side, where she grew up in a home filled with love but little else. Her mother had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, and when illness came, it didn't knock politely. Diabetes took her mother's strength piece by piece, until Maya found herself helping her dress in the morning, measuring insulin at night, sitting by her side through long hospital visits. She had dreams once, dreams that stretched far beyond this lounge. In college, Maya was the kind of student professors remembered, sharp, determined, the one who always raised her hand with the answer nobody else had. She had even earned a place in one of the most competitive internships in the business world, the kind of opportunity that could have changed everything. But bills don't wait for dreams. When her mother's health declined, Maya made a choice. She walked away from that internship, from the future she had imagined, and stepped into jobs that paid rent and covered prescriptions. Morning shifts at a bookstore, evenings waiting tables, nights scrubbing offices when the city slept. She never complained. She never asked for pity. She just worked because survival doesn't give you the luxury of self-pity. And yet, even in the grind, she carried herself with grace. People often underestimated her, saw only the uniform, never the person inside it. But Maya learned to let that underestimation protect her. She listened when others ignored her. She watched when others were too busy talking. She understood how people revealed their truest selves when they believed no one important was paying attention. That's why, when Richard Hale spat his words across the lounge, she didn't crumble. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to make her small. But she knew something Richard never would. You can't shrink a person who already knows their own worth. She lifted her chin just slightly, steadying her breath, and returned to her work as if nothing had happened. But inside, she knew, and so did everyone watching, that everything had. Richard tried to reclaim the room. He straightened his jacket, forced a laugh, and spoke louder than before, as though volume could erase what had just happened. "Let's be honest," he said, lifting his glass toward the table of investors. "Business isn't about feelings, it's about strength, about knowing who's in charge." His words weren't shouted, but the arrogance in them spread like smoke. And then, almost casually, he gestured toward Maya, who was quietly refilling a glass at another table. Some people serve, some people lead. That's just the way the world works. It was meant as a dismissal, a way to brush her off, but instead it carved another line through the air. Conversations that had begun to resume stopped again. Guests shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but unable to look away. Maya didn't flinch. She finished pouring the glass of water, set the pitcher down with steady hands, and turned to walk past his table. She had every reason to ignore him, every reason to stay silent. But something in the weight of the room, in the expectant eyes of strangers, told her this moment demanded more. She paused just long enough to look at him, not defiant, not pleading, simply clear and calm. "Respect," she said softly, "isn't about who leads and who serves, it's about how we treat each other while we do both." The sentence wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was the kind of truth that can't be pushed aside. Her voice carried steady through the lounge, and the silence afterward was louder than applause. Richard opened his mouth to fire back, but nothing came. He settled for a smirk, as if her words were beneath him, but the crack in his confidence was visible. At the far end of the table, Elliot Strauss lowered his glass and studied Maya for the first time with real attention. His gaze lingered, thoughtful, almost protective, while Richard rambled on about market shares and quarterly projections. The investors were no longer watching Richard, they were watching the young woman he had just tried and failed to diminish. And for the first time all evening, the balance of power in the room had shifted. The weight of Maya's words lingered long after she walked away. Respect isn't about who leads and who serves. It's about how we treat each other while we do both. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The line had landed like a stone in water, sending ripples across every table. A woman near the bar murmured to her husband, "She's right." A young traveller lifted his phone higher, capturing Richard's frozen face and Maya's calm retreat. Richard tried to laugh, but it cracked in his throat. "Cute," he muttered, waving his hand as if brushing away a fly. "Let's get back to real business." But for the first time all evening, his voice didn't command the room. It sounded thinner, forced. People weren't leaning toward him anymore. They were leaning back, studying him with quiet judgment. And when their eyes did shift, it was toward Maya, moving gracefully between tables, as though she hadn't just reshaped the energy of the entire lounge. She didn't seek the spotlight. She carried on with her work, a glass of water here, a soft smile to an elderly traveller there. But every gesture only amplified the contrast. Her quiet dignity made Richard's arrogance feel louder. At the head of the table, Elliot Strauss remained silent, his expression unreadable. But his silence wasn't emptiness, it was weight. Those who knew him recognised it. Elliot was a man who rarely spoke, but when he did, it meant something. And tonight, he wasn't speaking to Richard, he was watching Maya. When she passed his table, Elliot's gaze followed her, steady and deliberate. He didn't nod, he didn't smile. But in the stillness of that moment, everyone could feel it. He had seen something Richard had missed. Richard, oblivious, launched into another pitch, filling the air with talk of market expansion and guaranteed returns. But his words now felt like noise, a desperate attempt to drown out the truth that had already been spoken. The lounge, once his stage, no longer belonged to him. The attention, the respect, the quiet power of the room. Without lifting her voice, Maya had taken it all, and Richard didn't even realise it. Richard's voice rolled on, but it no longer carried the weight he thought it did. He filled the silence with big promises, returns, growth, dominance, each word landing flatter than the last. Investors nodded politely, but their eyes kept drifting, not to him, but to the young woman he had tried to shrink. Finally, Elliot Strauss set down his fork. The soft sound of silver on porcelain drew more attention than Richard's entire pitch. Richard froze mid-sentence, a practiced smile plastered on his face, but his eyes flickered with unease. Elliot didn't look at him, he looked at Maya. "Miss," he said gently, his voice carrying across the table, "would you step closer, please?" Every head turned. Servers did not get invited into conversations like this. Maya hesitated for a heartbeat, then moved forward, her posture straight, her steps measured. She stopped at Elliot's side, the tray still in her hands. Richard let out a strained laugh. "Mr. Strauss, if we could stay focused on the deal." But Elliot lifted his hand and the entire room stilled. He turned his gaze to the investors around him. "Some of you may not know this," he began, "but this young woman once worked at Hale Enterprises. Not as a server, not as background, she was one of their most promising interns." Gasps rippled across the lounge, phones tilted higher. Richard's smile faltered. "She excelled," Elliot continued. "She impressed everyone who had the privilege of reading her reports or hearing her ideas. But she walked away. Not because she lacked ability, not because she failed, but because she refused to accept a culture that treated people as disposable." Maya's breath caught. She hadn't expected her past to be laid bare in this room. Still, she stood tall, her eyes steady. When Elliot glanced at her, she gave a small nod, her voice calm but firm. "That's true." The truth hung there, undeniable. Elliot leaned back slightly, his words as calm as they were cutting. "So when Mr. Hale dismissed her tonight as though she were invisible, he did more than insult a woman doing her job. He reminded us all why she left his company in the first place." The silence that followed wasn't shock anymore, it was judgment. Investors shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads, others exchanging knowing looks. Richard swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure, but it was too late. His arrogance had dragged his past into the light, and now it stood beside him, living, breathing, undeniable. And for the first time all evening, everyone knew exactly who the real leader in the room was, and it wasn't Richard Hale. The room was no longer on Richard Hale's side. He felt it in the way people shifted in their chairs, in the way no one laughed at his half-hearted jokes, in the glow of phone screens quietly pointed in his direction. For years, he had controlled rooms like this with ease, his words sharp, his confidence unshakable. But tonight, no matter how hard he spoke, his voice couldn't drown out the truth. At first, the ripple was small. A guest near the window whispered, "It's already online." Another scrolled through their feed, eyes widening as a shaky video of the moment played back. The caption beneath it read, "Billionaire insults young woman at airport lounge." Within minutes, the clip spread further, comments piled up. "This is disgusting. Who talks to someone like that?" That woman held more dignity in silence than he had in his entire speech. Richard noticed the shift, the way investors' eyes darted to their phones instead of his face, the way whispers turned into a low hum that no longer included him. His jaw tightened, he gripped his glass too hard, his laugh turning brittle. "Distractions," he said loudly, forcing the word through clenched teeth. "That's all this is. Business isn't about feelings, it's about dominance." But no one was listening anymore. Maya, meanwhile, moved quietly through the lounge, gathering plates, refilling water, offering gentle nods to those who thanked her. She didn't raise her voice, didn't try to claim the spotlight. Yet somehow, every eye followed her. She was the calm in the storm Richard himself had created. At the head of the table, Elliot Strauss remained still. He hadn't spoken since revealing Maya's past, but his silence carried more weight than Richard's entire pitch. Investors read it clearly. He was done. His decision was already made. Richard's phone buzzed on the table again and again. Board members, advisors, reporters, each call a reminder that the walls of the lounge could not contain what had happened. The world was watching now. He tried one last time, raising his voice, his words almost frantic. "You don't build billion-dollar companies by worrying about hurt feelings." The sentence hung there, heavy and tone-deaf. A woman at the bar muttered, "And you don't keep them by disrespecting people either." A few heads nodded, the line spread like a spark caught by those still recording. Richard Hale had always believed power was measured in money, in titles, in fear. Tonight, in real time, he was learning that power could just as easily be lost, in a single sentence, in a single video, in a single moment of arrogance. And the whole world had just seen it. The main course was served, but no one seemed hungry anymore. Plates of steak sat untouched, steam curling upward and fading into the heavy silence that filled the lounge. On any other night, this would have been the moment where laughter returned, where business softened into small talk. But tonight, the air was too thick. Every fork, every knife, every word felt suspended. Richard kept going, desperate to convince himself the night wasn't slipping away. He leaned in, gesturing wildly, tossing out numbers and timelines. His smile stretched too tight. 3 billion in growth, double your return in under 2 years. This deal will make history. But the more he spoke, the less the words mattered. The investors weren't leaning in, they were leaning away. Their eyes flickered to their phones, to one another, anywhere but at him. His voice sounded like static, background noise to the moment they had all just witnessed. And then Elliot Strauss moved. He didn't stand, he didn't raise his voice. He simply set down his knife and fork, folded his hands and looked across the table. The room went still. "Mr. Hale," he said quietly, almost kindly, "before I invest in any company, I look for one thing above all else: values." The line was simple, but it landed with the force of a verdict. Every person in the room knew what it meant. Richard laughed too quickly, the sound sharp and nervous. "Of course, that's exactly what makes us strong. We don't waste time on weakness." No one laughed with him. The silence that followed was brutal, sharper than any insult. A man in a grey suit cleared his throat and set down his glass. A woman near the window shook her head. The investors were no longer questioning the deal, they were questioning Richard himself. Meanwhile, Maya stepped forward with quiet grace, carrying a pitcher of water. She refilled Elliot's glass first, then the others one by one, saving Richard's for last. The gesture was small, but unmistakable. Respect given where it was earned. Richard noticed. His jaw tightened, his hand curling against the table. But he said nothing. For the first time all evening, he seemed to realise that nothing he could say would change the truth. Elliot leaned slightly toward his assistant, whispered just a few words. The assistant rose immediately and slipped out through a side door, phone already in hand. Richard didn't know it yet, but the decision had already been made. The buzz started quietly, like static in the background. A man near the window lowered his phone and whispered, "It's already on Twitter." A woman refreshed her screen and gasped softly. The shaky clip of Richard Hale's insult, his voice sharp, his smirk clear, Maya's calm face unshaken, was already spreading. By the time dessert was offered, the first headlines had appeared. Billionaire lashes out at lounge worker. Investor dinner derailed by public insult. The video racked up thousands of views by the minute, comments flooding in from strangers who had never set foot in that room, but now felt like witnesses. Richard's phone buzzed non-stop on the table. He ignored the first call, then the second. By the third, his hand hovered above it, his knuckles pale. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Investors leaned back in their seats, scrolling through feeds, watching the very moment they had just lived now play out in real time online. The captions beneath the clips were merciless. "Respect is real business too." The words Maya had spoken were already trending. Richard tried to laugh it off, his voice too loud, too brittle. "You know how the internet is," he said, waving a hand. "They twist things, exaggerate. We're here for serious business." But his words only made the silence heavier. Everyone knew what they had seen, and now so did the world. Maya moved quietly through the room, gathering empty glasses, her steps steady, her shoulders straight. She hadn't asked for attention, yet she had it. Each time she passed a table, guests looked up, offering small nods, soft smiles, acknowledgements that carried more weight than applause. At the head of the table, Elliot Strauss sat motionless, but the message was clear. He didn't need to raise his voice. His silence was already the loudest in the room. And as Richard's phone lit up again, board members, reporters, advisors demanding answers, he finally realised what had slipped through his hands. This wasn't just a dinner gone wrong. It was a disaster playing out live, one he could never spin back into control. Because the moment had already left the lounge, it belonged to the world now. By sunrise, the story was everywhere. Clips from the lounge replayed on morning shows, headlines sprawled across news sites, hashtags climbing faster than anyone could keep up. Respect first, stand with Maya. Her name, once unknown outside her circle, now carried weight in households she'd never stepped into. Richard Hale's empire, meanwhile, was unravelling. His company's board held emergency calls through the night. Investors demanded statements, and reporters camped outside his office doors. But while the cameras hunted his downfall, another story quietly rose in its shadow. The story of the woman he had tried to dismiss. Maya began her morning the way she always had, walking her mother down the cracked sidewalk to the clinic for her appointment. The winter air was sharp, her mother's hand warm in hers. Strangers passed by and whispered, "That's her," offering quiet nods, a few even reaching out to say thank you. Maya smiled politely, but inside she carried the same steady calm as always. She hadn't asked for fame, she had asked only for dignity. That afternoon, a black sedan pulled up outside her modest apartment building. This time it wasn't press, it was Elliot Strauss. He didn't send an assistant, didn't request a polished meeting downtown. He knocked on her door himself. "Maya," he said when she opened it, his voice warm but direct. "May I come in?" They sat at her small kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the pauses between words. Elliot spoke plainly. He admired her composure, the way she had carried herself when the world might have expected her to crumble. He told her he believed that strength like hers didn't just belong in survival, it belonged in leadership. "I want you to join my team," Elliot said, his eyes steady on hers. "Not as staff, not as an intern, as a leader. We're creating a role, Director of People and Culture, someone who can remind us that numbers mean nothing if people are treated like nothing, and I can't think of anyone more qualified." Maya stared at him, unsure if she had heard him right. Her life had been measured in long shifts, in balancing bills, in making sacrifices no one saw. Leadership? That had felt like a dream she left behind years ago. Her mother coughed softly from the next room, and Maya thought of every night she had carried the weight of 2 lives on her shoulders. She thought of every job, every insult, every quiet moment where she wondered if her choices had erased her future. And now, somehow, those choices had brought her here. She lifted her eyes and said, calm but certain, "I'll do it, but only if it means real change, not just headlines." Elliot nodded once, a small smile breaking through his calm. "That's exactly why I'm asking you." In that tiny kitchen, with chipped mugs and sunlight spilling across the counter, Maya's life quietly turned a corner. A week later, Maya stood on a stage she never imagined for herself. No tray in her hands, no uniform pressed tight across her shoulders, just a simple navy blazer, her hair pulled back, and the steady calm of a woman who had been tested and had endured. In front of her sat employees from across Strauss Holdings, some in the room, thousands more watching live from screens in offices across the country. Many of them had seen the clip before they had ever seen her in person. To them, she was already a symbol. But tonight they would hear her voice. Maya stepped to the microphone. For a moment she let the silence breathe, then she began. "Last week, I was told I didn't belong. Not because I failed, not because I made a mistake, but because someone believed their title gave them the right to strip away my dignity." The room was still. You could hear the soft hum of the lights above, the shuffle of someone adjusting in their seat, but nothing else. "In that moment I stayed quiet," she continued, "but today I choose to speak. Because respect isn't optional. It isn't earned by wealth or demanded by fear. It is the starting point, the baseline. Without it, nothing we build will last." Heads nodded across the room. Some employees lowered their eyes, remembering moments when they had been overlooked, or worse, dismissed. Others leaned forward, drawn in by the steady strength in her tone. "True leadership isn't about who talks the loudest," Maya said. "It's about who listens the closest. It's not about who sits at the head of the table, it's about whether the person clearing it is treated like they matter, because they do." Applause rose, not polite, but real, rolling through the room like a wave. People clapped because they believed her, because her words weren't polished lines on a teleprompter. They were lived. That night, when the cameras were gone and the building had emptied, Maya walked home. She opened the door to her small apartment, and there was her mother waiting, a blanket across her lap, eyes shining. "I'm proud of you, baby," her mother whispered. Maya smiled, setting her bag down, sinking into the chair beside her. For once, she wasn't coming home exhausted from a shift. She was coming home carrying something else, hope. And in that quiet moment, Maya understood. The real victory wasn't in the headlines or the title on her new office door. It was in proving that even the smallest voice, spoken with dignity, could change the world. Because respect has no price, and once you live it out loud, it belongs to everyone. Lesson: respect is not a luxury. It is the foundation. Titles and money can vanish overnight, but the way we treat others defines our true worth. Thank you for watching all the way through this story. Your support means more than I can say. If it touched you, please remember to like and subscribe, and join me again here on Rain Inside for the next story.